It was a quiet Sunday night in Beverly Hills, August 20th, 1989. The kind of night where, the scent of jasmine just hangs heavy in the air, and the only sounds are the gentle hum of pool filters and that distant traffic. Inside the sprawling mansion at 722 North Elm Drive, Jose and Kitty Menendez were settling in. They were watching a movie, maybe eating a bowl of ice cream. They were a portrait of success, a family that had seemingly achieved the American dream. But dreams, as we know, can sometimes curdle into nightmares. And on that particular night, a nightmare was about to unfold in the most violent way imaginable. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered. Not by one gunshot, but by many. A brutal, deafening barrage of shotgun blasts that echoed through the opulent living room. When the silence finally returned, it was a heavy, chilling silence. Jose Menendez, a high-powered entertainment executive, and his wife Kitty were gone. Their lives had been extinguished with a ferocity that really defied comprehension. The scene that awaited the first responders was one of almost unimaginable carnage. A bloody tableau that would be seared into the memory of this exclusive sun-drenched neighborhood forever. It was a crime so savage it felt personal. Sometime later, a frantic 911 call came in. The voice on the other end was choked with emotion, gasping for air between sobs. It was Lyle Menendez, the elder son. "Somebody killed my parents!" he screamed. He and his younger brother Eric claimed they had gone to the movies and returned home to discover this horrific scene. They presented themselves as two grief-stricken sons, their world torn apart in an instant. They wept, they held each other. To the outside world, they were victims, orphaned in the most terrible way. But was it grief that fueled their tears, or was it something else entirely? The initial investigation struggled to find a motive. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value appeared to be stolen. The police were baffled. Who would want to execute a wealthy couple in their own home with such overkill? Theories ranged from a mafia hit connected to Jose's business dealings to a professional job gone wrong. No one at first dared to look at the two young men who seemed so utterly devastated by the loss. No one suspected that the call for help might have come from the very hands that pulled the triggers. But in Beverly Hills, secrets have a way of surfacing, much like cracks in the pavement after an earthquake. Lyle and Eric Menendez seemed to have it all. They were the sons of a Cuban immigrant, Jose, who had clawed his way to the top of the corporate ladder, becoming a millionaire executive at Live Entertainment. Their mother, Kitty, was a former beauty queen. They lived in a mansion, drove expensive cars, and wanted for nothing material. From the outside, their life was a glossy magazine cover, a picture of privilege and opportunity. They attended prestigious schools, played competitive sports, and traveled the world. It was a life many would envy, a golden existence under the warm California sun. But gold, as we've learned, can sometimes be just a thin plating over a darker, colder metal. Lyle, the older brother, was 21 at the time of the murders. He was seen as the more assertive one, a student at Princeton University, though his academic career was less than stellar. He had a taste for the finer things, Rolex watches, fancy cars, and ambitious business ventures that often fizzled out. Eric, at 18, was the quieter, more sensitive of the two. He was a talented tennis player with aspirations of going pro, but he was also described as shy and emotionally fragile. Together they were two sides of the same coin, bound by a family dynamic that appeared perfect but was, according to them, anything but. Their father, Jose, was a demanding, domineering figure. He pushed his sons relentlessly, expecting nothing short of perfection in sports, in school, and in life. His love, it seemed, was conditional, tied directly to their achievements. Failures were not tolerated. They were met with intense pressure and disappointment. Kitty, their mother, was more complex. She was often portrayed as a nervous, unhappy woman, caught between her husband's ambitions and her son's struggles. She was described as increasingly reclusive and emotionally unstable in the years leading up to her death. The family, for all its wealth, was isolated, an island of opulence with troubled waters swirling just beneath the surface. So, while the world saw two handsome, privileged young men, the reality they would later describe was one of living in a gilded cage. They were surrounded by luxury but starved of genuine affection and emotional safety. It was a life of high expectations and crushing pressure, where image was everything and authentic feelings were suppressed. This pristine Beverly Hills facade, they would argue, concealed a dark and terrifying secret. A secret so profound, they claimed, that it would eventually lead them down a path from which there was no return, culminating in that bloody night on Elm Drive. When the reason for the murders finally came to light, it was a bombshell. It was not a mob hit. It was not a business deal gone sour. According to the brothers, it was a desperate act of survival. Eric Menendez, racked with guilt, confessed to his psychologist L. Jerome Oziel. In those recorded sessions, a horrifying story emerged. The brothers claimed they had been the victims of years of unspeakable abuse at the hands of their father, Jose. They alleged a long, dark history of sexual, psychological, and emotional torment that began when they were just young boys, a secret that had festered in the shadows of their perfect home. This was the defense's central argument, a story of two boys pushed to the brink, living in constant fear. They painted a portrait of Jose Menendez not as a successful executive but as a monstrous predator who controlled every aspect of their lives. They claimed the abuse was a well-guarded family secret, one that their mother, Kitty, was aware of but was too weak or too frightened to stop. In fact, they alleged she was often a participant in the psychological cruelty, a broken woman who enabled her husband's monstrous behavior. This narrative changed everything. It transformed the case from a simple story of greed into a complex and tragic family drama. The defense argued that on the night of the murders, the brothers believed their lives were in imminent danger. They claimed their father had threatened to kill them to prevent them from exposing his secrets. The act of arming themselves with shotguns and confronting their parents was not a cold, calculated plan for murder, they said, but a preemptive strike born of terror. It was, in their telling, a tragic case of imperfect self-defense. They killed, their lawyers would argue, because they believed if they didn't, they would be the ones found dead. They were not monsters. They were terrified children trapped in the bodies of young men. This defense forced the public, and later the jury, to ask a difficult question. Could years of horrific abuse justify such a brutal act? It shifted the focus from the bloody crime scene to the hidden trauma that allegedly preceded it. The narrative was no longer about two wealthy sons killing for an inheritance. Instead, it became a story about the long-term effects of childhood trauma and the desperate lengths to which victims might go to escape their tormentors. The question was no longer just what they did, but why they did it. And that why would become the dividing line in this case for decades to come. While the defense was building a narrative of fear and abuse, the prosecution was painting a very different picture. And it was a picture painted with credit card receipts and lavish expenditures. In the months following their parents' murders, Lyle and Eric Menendez embarked on a spending spree that was, to put it mildly, extravagant. The two seemingly grief-stricken orphans began to live like kings. Their behavior, prosecutors argued, was not that of traumatized victims, but of cold, calculating killers enjoying the spoils of their crime. Their inheritance was estimated at around $14 million, and they appeared eager to start spending it. The list of purchases was staggering. Lyle bought a Rolex watch, a Porsche Carrera, and a popular chicken wing restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, which he named Mr. Buffalo's. Eric hired a personal tennis coach for $60,000 a year and competed in a series of tournaments in Israel. They went on shopping sprees, buying expensive designer clothes and electronics. They traveled, took lavish vacations, and threw parties. To the investigators watching them, this cascade of spending looked less like an attempt to numb their pain and more like a celebration of newfound freedom and wealth. It was a classic motive, as old as time itself: murder for money. The prosecution used this spending as the cornerstone of their case. They argued that the brothers had grown impatient. They were tired of living under their father's thumb, tired of waiting for the fortune they felt they were owed. They wanted the lifestyle without the rules, the money without the man who controlled it. The murders, according to this theory, were a cold-blooded and meticulously planned execution designed to unlock their inheritance. The tears, the 911 call, the claims of finding the bodies, it was all a performance, a carefully constructed act to deceive the police. This narrative was simple, clean, and compelling. It didn't require delving into the murky depths of alleged family secrets and psychological trauma. It was a story of greed. The brothers saw their parents as an obstacle to the life they wanted, and they removed that obstacle in the most brutal way possible. The prosecution presented them not as victims, but as spoiled, sociopathic young men who believed they could get away with the perfect crime. Their lavish lifestyle after the murders was, in the eyes of the state, their biggest mistake, a blatant display of guilt that spoke louder than any tearful testimony ever could. The case against the Menendez brothers might have remained circumstantial, a battle of competing narratives, were it not for a crucial turning point: the confession. 7 months after the murders, a deeply troubled Eric Menendez could no longer bear the weight of his secret. He broke down and confessed everything to his psychologist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. He detailed the planning, the execution of the crime, and the overwhelming guilt that haunted him. He didn't just confess for himself, he implicated his older brother Lyle as the mastermind behind the plot. It was a stunning admission, a crack in the facade that would blow the case wide open. However, this confession was not made in a police interrogation room. It was made within the supposedly sacred and confidential space of a therapy session. The relationship between a patient and a therapist is protected by law, a seal of privacy meant to encourage honesty without fear of reprisal. But this situation was complicated. Dr. Oziel, fearing for his own safety after Lyle allegedly made threats against him, had his mistress, Judalon Smith, secretly listen in on some of the sessions. Even more damning, Oziel himself had taped many of his sessions with the brothers, creating a physical record of their confessions. The existence of these tapes set off a massive legal battle. The defense fought fiercely to have them suppressed, arguing they were a clear violation of patient-therapist privilege. They claimed Dr. Oziel had manipulated a vulnerable Eric and violated his ethical duties for his own gain. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that the privilege was voided because Lyle had threatened the doctor, placing the confessions outside the bounds of protected communication. The courts had to decide, could these private, therapeutic recordings be used as evidence in a double murder trial? Ultimately, the California Supreme Court ruled that some of the tapes were admissible. It was a devastating blow to the defense and a monumental victory for the prosecution. The jury would now be able to hear, in the brothers' own words, details of the crime. While the defense would argue the confessions were coerced from a terrified and manipulated young man, the prosecution now had what they considered a smoking gun. The tapes seemed to corroborate their theory of a premeditated plot, not a spontaneous act of fear. The private words, spoken in what was thought to be a safe space, were about to become very, very public. The Menendez brothers were tried together, but their fates were decided by two separate juries, one for Lyle and one for Eric. This unusual setup meant that two different sets of 12 people heard the same evidence, the same tearful testimony about abuse, and the same damning details about the spending sprees. The first trial, which began in 1993, became a national sensation. For months, television cameras broadcast the proceedings, allowing the public to watch the high-stakes legal battle unfold in real time. It was, honestly, a spectacle that captivated and divided the country, turning living rooms into makeshift jury boxes. The defense's strategy was essentially to put the parents, Jose and Kitty, on trial. They presented a relentless and harrowing account of abuse, calling witnesses, including a cousin, who testified to seeing signs of inappropriate behavior from Jose. The brothers themselves took the stand, delivering emotional, often weeping testimony that described a childhood filled with terror and shame. Eric, in particular, appeared fragile and broken, recounting the alleged abuse in graphic detail. Their lawyers argued that the brothers had developed a form of post-traumatic stress disorder and that they genuinely believed they were in mortal danger on the night of the killings. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanik, relentlessly attacked the abuse claims as a complete fabrication. They argued it was a cynical and desperate defense invented after the fact, once the brothers realized the police were closing in. Bozanik cross-examined the brothers for days, pointing out inconsistencies in their stories and highlighting their lavish spending as the true motive. She portrayed them as brilliant actors capable of crying on cue to manipulate the jury. She asked the jury to focus not on the unprovable claims of what happened behind closed doors, but on the undeniable, brutal evidence of the crime itself. In the end, the strategy of using two juries led to a stunning outcome, both juries deadlocked. They were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. For Eric's jury, the votes were split between murder and the lesser charge of manslaughter, with some jurors convinced by the abuse defense. For Lyle's jury, the division was similar. The result was a mistrial. The prosecution had failed to get a conviction, but the defense had failed to secure an acquittal. The brothers would have to be tried again, but this first trial had proven one thing. Their story, whether true or false, was powerful enough to sow reasonable doubt in the minds of many. If the first trial was a sensation, the second trial, which began in 1995, was a different beast altogether. The media landscape had shifted, and so had the legal strategy. The judge for the retrial, Stanley Weisberg, made a crucial decision: the proceedings would not be televised. This immediately changed the atmosphere, removing the constant glare of the public eye from the courtroom itself. More importantly, Judge Weisberg severely limited the defense's ability to build their case around the theory of imperfect self-defense that had been so central to the first trial's hung jury. The focus was now squarely back on the act of murder. Without the cameras, and with a judge who kept a much tighter rein on the proceedings, the narrative shifted dramatically. The prosecution, now led by David Kahn, presented a more streamlined and aggressive case. They relentlessly hammered home the motive of greed. They argued that the abuse allegations were a scam, a desperate and disgusting lie designed to let two cold-blooded killers escape justice. They portrayed the brothers as arrogant, spoiled brats who thought their wealth and privilege could buy them a get-out-of-jail-free card. The emotional, tear-filled testimony of the first trial was met with far more skepticism this time around. The defense found itself on the back foot. Their key psychological theory was restricted, and they were unable to present the same sprawling narrative of victimhood that had resonated with the first juries. The absence of television cameras also meant they couldn't appeal directly to the public for sympathy in the same way. The media circus had moved outside the courthouse, but inside, the legal battle was far more constrained and focused. The story of abuse, which had once been the headline, was now relegated to a subplot in a story that was increasingly about a brutal, premeditated, double homicide. This time, there was no deadlock. With a single jury hearing the case under the new, stricter rules, the outcome was swift and decisive. On March 20, 1996, the jury found both Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They also found true the special circumstances of lying in wait and murder for financial gain, which made the brothers eligible for the death penalty. The legal saga was over. The media circus packed up its tents. The 2 brothers, once the talk of the nation, were now convicted killers, facing the possibility of execution for the murders of their parents. Even after the guilty verdict, the case of the Menendez brothers refused to settle into a simple narrative of good versus evil. The nation remained profoundly divided, and the debate over their motives continued to rage long after the courtroom doors were closed. On one side were those who saw the verdict as justice served. For them, Lyle and Eric were the ultimate symbols of spoiled, entitled youth. They were sociopaths who concocted a vile story about their deceased parents to cover up a crime born of pure greed. The evidence of their spending spree was proof enough that their tears were fake, and their hearts were cold. On the other side were those who believed the brothers, or at least believed that the truth was far more complicated. This group saw them as tragic figures, victims of a dark secret who were pushed beyond human endurance. They argued that the legal system had failed them, silencing their story of abuse in the second trial and focusing only on the money. To this day, a vocal contingent of supporters maintains that the brothers were wrongly convicted of first-degree murder, and that their actions, while extreme, were a direct result of years of trauma. They were not evil, this side argues, but broken. The rise of the internet and social media in the years since has only amplified this division. A new generation, discovering the case through documentaries and online forums, has breathed new life into the debate. Clips from the first trial, showing Eric's raw emotional testimony, have gone viral, convincing many younger viewers that the abuse was real. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about childhood trauma, parental abuse, and the flaws within the justice system. The brothers have become symbols, either of unchecked privilege or of systemic failure, depending on which side you take. This enduring fascination speaks to the powerful unanswered questions at the heart of the story. Can we ever truly know what happens behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect family? How does extreme wealth and privilege intersect with profound psychological distress? And at what point does a victim's response to abuse cross a line from which there is no return? The Menendez case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, secrets, and violence, and because there are no easy answers, we, as a nation, remain captivated and divided by the 2 boys who killed their parents on that summer night in Beverly Hills. Today is August 8, 2025. More than 3 decades have passed since that violent night on Elm Drive. Lyle and Eric Menendez are now middle-aged men. They have spent more of their lives inside a prison cell than outside of one. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that spared them from death row, but guaranteed they would never again know freedom. For years, they were housed in separate facilities, their close bond severed by the prison system. In 2018, they were reunited in the same correctional facility in San Diego, a small mercy in a life sentence. The case itself has become a kind of modern American myth. It has been the subject of countless books, movies, and television series. It exists now less as a legal case and more as a cultural artifact, a story we tell ourselves about wealth, family, and the dark side of the American dream. Each new documentary or podcast brings a new wave of interest, a new generation to debate the guilt or victimhood of the two brothers. The core question remains as potent today as it was in 1993. Were they cold-blooded killers or desperate abused children? Perhaps the reason we can't let it go is that the case holds up a mirror to our own fears and uncertainties. It forces us to acknowledge that the most horrific acts can happen in the most beautiful of places, and that the people we think we know can harbor secrets we can't possibly imagine. The story of the Menendez brothers is unsettling because it resists easy categorization. If you believe the abuse, you must grapple with the brutality of their response. If you believe it was for money, you must grapple with the chilling emptiness at the heart of two young men. And so, the question lingers in the air, hanging there like the scent of jasmine on a warm Beverly Hills night. What do you believe happened in that house? Do you see two greedy sons who planned the perfect murder to get rich? Or do you see two broken victims who saw no other way out? The final verdict was rendered in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, the jury is still out, and perhaps it always will be. Because the story of Lyle and Eric Menendez is not just about what they did, but about the terrifying, unknowable space between murder and misery.